Hi, everyone. I'm Paul. I'm the executive director at New City Initiative. And New City is a nonprofit that is dedicated to fostering communities where all people achieve their full human potential. And what I want to do today is to try to tie some elements of the exercises together that we've been doing, and specifically to talk a little bit about how we can bring more creativity, more curiosity, and more compassion to our everyday life. And I want to start by telling you a story that comes from the Egyptian desert, actually, in the 5th century. And the story is about a monk who suspected another monk of having violated his vow of celibacy. And so the first monk was always on the lookout for any evidence to corroborate his suspicions about the second monk. And after he had watched this other monk for some time, he started to notice something. He noticed that it often happened that late at night, the second monk would leave his quarters after everyone else had gone to bed, and he would return early in the morning before everyone else got up. And so the first monk decided that he was going to find out what in the world was going on. And so he thought he would follow the second monk. And so late one night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, he heard the second monk's door creak open and then closed. And so he crept out of his quarters and went to follow this other monk to see what was going on. When he got outside, it was dark, and it took his eyes a few minutes to adjust to the darkness. And by that point, the second monk had disappeared. He was nowhere to be seen. But after he spent some time peering around in the darkness, he finally spotted the second monk, and there he was, how do they say, in flagrante delicto, with a woman in the shadows, half hidden in the darkness. So he watched them for a couple of minutes, and his wrath was rising and going up, and finally he could stand it no longer, and he went over and he started kicking them and shouting, "How dare you? How long are you going to go on like this?" And when he did that, he discovered that what he had thought was the brother and a woman was a pile of burlap sacks in the shadow of some tree branches waving in the moonlight. And as he was standing there astonished, trying to figure out what to do, he hears a voice at his elbow saying, "Brother, is everything all right?" So he turns and he looks, and there is the second monk with a look of concern on his face, and he is still kneeling in the spot where he had been praying. This little story has, I think, a pretty powerful message. And the message is this: how you see determines what you see and what you do not see. So the first monk, by looking at the world through the lens of his judgments, his vision became distorted. And the truth is that you and I make judgments about other people all the time, every day, don't we? And let me be specific what I mean by judgments. When I say judgment, what I mean is something about you that you pin on someone else. Generally, this is going to be something that makes you uncomfortable or something that you don't like very much about yourself. So you take that part of you that you don't like or that you feel discomfort around, and you pin it on someone else, which is very convenient because then you can dislike that part of you in the other person instead of yourself. So maybe the first monk felt uncomfortable about his own temptations, and that is why he ended up pinning them on the second monk. So if something about someone else really gets under your skin, is like fingernails on the chalkboard for you, you just cannot even stand to be around someone when they exhibit a particular behavior, pay attention to that, because the great likelihood is that you are pinning something about yourself on that person. You're making a judgment. We all make judgments, and those judgments actually affect the way that we see. Sometimes, like the first monk, once you make a judgment, you stop seeing things as they really are, and you see things that aren't actually there. And so what can happen is that you start telling yourself a story to support your judgment. So we are very, very inventive. I think that the activities that we did at the tables have shown that we have incredibly fertile and creative minds, and we love to make up stories, especially stories about other people. And so what will happen is you make a judgment about someone, and then you immediately go looking for evidence to support the judgment that you have made. And you latch on to any details that support the judgment that you've made, your version of events, let's say, and you downplay or you minimize any evidence to the contrary. So for example, in an interaction with someone, you might downplay their good points, or you might play up their faults depending on the story that you're telling. We all have different stories, different ways of looking at the world. We can all look at the same objects or the same set of circumstances and come up with different stories. And as we're making up stories, what can easily happen is that a part of our sense of self gets tied up in the story. So when someone else's story is different from ours, diverges from ours, then we take it personally. If someone says or does something that goes against my story, my way of looking at things, my way of seeing the world, then I can easily get into conflict with that person. I might be thinking to myself, when someone says or does something that goes against my story, you are so wrong on this. Why can you not see that? Or, I have every right to be angry after what you did. Or, if you would just take my advice and pay attention to what I'm telling you, you would be much better off. Have you ever said that to someone? Have you ever thought that? You know, if I could just take over your life for a day, you would be way better off if I could just make those decisions for you. Which is all really, it all really boils down to one thing, which is I'm right and you're wrong. And we spend a lot of time on that kind of mental chatter that really just keeps circling back to this notion, I'm right and you're wrong. So this really is the human dilemma in a nutshell. We take things about ourselves we don't like and we pin them on other people. We make up stories to support the judgments that we make. And then we get into conflict with other people when their stories don't agree with ours. And this is something I think that comes up every day. It comes up all the time in everyday life. And I'm just going to take one of those hot button words that we use today and use it as a way of telling another story. And I'm going to tell it in such a way that I'm inviting you to be the first person in this story. So let's say, for example, that your partner has been gaining some weight lately, and it's really, really bothering you. You find that every time you sit down to dinner, you are monitoring what your partner is eating. You're counting the calories in every serving that they take. You are watching them like a hawk. And it's really, really starting to get to you. When you look at your partner, you notice that what you're thinking is, honey, you have really let yourself go. And so you think finally that you really have to say something to your partner. And so you decide that the way that you want to do this is you want to be playful and you want to be lighthearted. And so you make some teasing comments at first, but your partner doesn't take the hint. And so you escalate to more overt forms of shame. And you say things like, don't you think you've had enough already? And when your partner gets upset, then you start deflecting responsibility. You know, I'm only thinking of you and your health. And day in and day out, it's the same conflict. And you know that this isn't how you want to communicate with your partner. But the discomfort just keeps building up inside you like a pressure that needs to be let out. And you don't know what else to do. So what's happening here? If you could, instead of making a judgment, step back and become curious about what's happening, you might find yourself asking some questions. So one question that you might ask is, I wonder if there's something happening that I'm not seeing here. Maybe your partner is under some extra stress at work that you have no idea about. There might be a part of your partner's life that you are completely unable to see at this time, and that could be what's behind the change in eating habits that you're noticing. But it may be also that if you took some time and sat with what's going on, that you would ask yourself another and an even more important question, which is, I wonder why this bothers me so much. Maybe you were shamed for your body as a child, and your discomfort at what's going on with your partner is actually a lot about you. Something that's important to remember is that your judgments are always more about you than they are about the other person. And so it's important to be able to step back and ask yourself the question, when something is really making you uncomfortable, when something about another person is inspiring you to start making up stories, to ask yourself that question, what am I not seeing? And why does it bother me so much? To end the cycle of judgment and blame, what is really required is compassionate seeing. And what do I mean by compassionate seeing? So compassionate seeing is a commitment to seeing everything with radical and unconditional acceptance. No exceptions. So when you practice compassionate seeing, you are making a deal with yourself that you're not going to make any exception to looking at the world with this perspective of radical acceptance. When you look at the world in this way, you're making a choice to remain present to whatever you see, even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if it seems scary or ugly or painful or boring, and even really if it breaks your heart. And above all, you don't judge anyone for anything. As much as possible, you suspend your judgments about other people so that you can see clearly. You suspend the judgment. Is it bad or good? Is it right or wrong? Do I like it? Do I dislike it? And instead of making judgments, you wonder about things. I wonder what this is like for you. I wonder how it feels to be on the other side of me right now. You cultivate openness and curiosity. You try to approach your experiences with a flexible mindset instead of imposing rigid notions about how you think things ought to be. So those are the shoulds that we put on things. Things should be this way. You should do this. I should do that. And above all, you don't try to fix or change anything. You don't blame yourself, and you don't shame yourself or anyone else. You look deeply with the intention to understand. So there are two steps to compassionate seeing that I want to offer to you to think about and that you can take with you today. And they're both really codified or encoded in the universal religious prescription that we all know as the Golden Rule. And what is the Golden Rule? Treat others as you would want to be treated in their place. That's the Golden Rule, right? So what does that tell us about compassionate seeing? And I think the first thing it tells us is that the first step of compassionate seeing is to recognize the difference between yourself and another person. And that can be a little counterintuitive. Sometimes I think when we think about compassion, we think, I'm supposed to identify with the other person. There, but for the grace of God, go I. But that's still really about you, right? That's the I. I'm looking at myself and saying, oh, there's me. Whereas I think that compassionate seeing starts in a different place. You actually recognize and acknowledge another person as truly other, as a distinct individual with his or her own experiences, own preferences, own goals and ambitions and desires and hopes and dreams and wants, and that those are different from you. So you start from this place of acknowledging the difference. And often we don't do that. And what do we do instead? We treat other people basically as extensions of ourselves. We act as if our story, the story that we have made up, is or should be their story too. And then we get tangled up in their lives and in the outcomes of their decisions. And I think this is another important signal or something to pay attention to. Anytime that you notice that you are trying to manage other people's decisions or their choices or control the outcome of their behavior, that's a pretty good sign that you're having a hard time recognizing the difference between yourself and someone else. For all of us who are parents, one of the great challenges to us as parents is to recognize our children as unique individuals with their own life trajectory that can be different from ours. If you don't do that, we all recognize you end up making your children carry the burden of your successes and failures and all your unachieved ambitions and frustrations and goals. So as you recognize and accept the difference between yourself and someone else, what this naturally brings up is curiosity about the other person. And that's really the second step. After you recognize the difference between yourself and someone else, you make an imaginative leap. And this is where storytelling and our ability to tell stories actually becomes helpful and useful to us. The imaginative leap is an act of creativity. It's an act of artistry. It's a daring act. It's the same thing that novelists use when they're writing novels, that playwrights use when they're writing plays, that poets use when they're writing poetry. And what it really means is that you are trying to get across that that distance, that gap that separates you from someone else, and ask yourself the question, if I were this person in this situation, what would I think, how would I feel, and how would I want to be treated? I'm going to say that again. What I think are the three crucial questions. What would I think, how would I feel, and how would I want to be treated if I were this person in this situation? Not if I were me with my story, but if I were this person with this person's story. What would I think? How would I feel? And how would I want to be treated? Let me try to make this real and concrete for you. So let's say, for example, that you have a close friend who has decided to get a divorce. So there's another one of those hot button issues. Your friend, you know, has been unhappy in the marriage for some time, but you can't bring yourself to support your friend's decision. You know and like your friend's spouse, your children go to school together, and it feels wrong to you. And you've tried to share how you feel with your friend on a number of occasions, but your friend seems pretty adamant about the decision, and you notice that the topic now is starting to strain your relationship. You're starting to have a hard time talking with your friend. How do you practice compassionate seeing in a situation like this? So the first step, we said, recognize the difference between yourself and the other person. So what that means is acknowledging that whatever happens, whatever is the outcome of your friend's marriage, that's not your success or failure. That sounds easy, and it actually can be much harder than it sounds, because it may be that your repeated and insistent attempts to talk your friend out of leaving the marriage reflect something about you. It might reflect something about your happiness in your own marriage. Maybe the person you're trying to persuade to stay in the marriage isn't your friend. Maybe it's you. Maybe you've been feeling not so great or not so happy in your relationship. And when you say to your friend, you know, no matter what's happening, you know, people should stick it out and should stay in there. Like, who are you talking to? That's a really important question to start with. You recognize the difference between yourself and the other person. And then the next step is you make that imaginative leap. So in this case, that means asking yourself those same questions. If I were this person in this situation, what would I think? How would I feel? How would I want to be treated? And I'll add one more question, which is, what kind of friend would I want in a situation like this? So the answer probably is not someone who would judge you or question your intentions as you were going through one of the most difficult decisions that you can ever make in your whole life. What would you want? Someone who would listen, someone who would simply be present, someone who would be willing to hear everything that is being shared without judgment. And the truth is that can open up some new conversations. Because here's the thing, it might be that your friend is not as confident in this decision as might seem at first. Your friend might be pretty ambivalent about the decision and not sharing that information with you, knowing that you're going to latch on to those doubts and say, see, I told you you shouldn't get divorced. So if you are willing to approach the situation without judgment, you're actually going to create a supportive environment in which your friend is going to be able to make the best possible choice. And really, ultimately, that's what we're all aiming for. That's what compassionate seeing is all about, creating that supportive environment where people can make the most healthy and positive choices for themselves. So I want to offer you a simple tool that you can use when you're practicing compassionate seeing, because I think all of us need, sometimes we use the word now, hacks. We need hacks, life hacks, to be able to engage our curiosity, to be able to engage our creativity when we're not feeling curious and when we're not feeling particularly creative. The truth is that other people are endlessly more fascinating than the objects that you came in and looked at on the table. But when we come in, we see those and we say, oh, those are curios. They're curious. I'm interested in them. Other people are fascinating. Their stories are endlessly various if we can just engage that curiosity and creativity. So I'm going to teach you a tool that I use, and the rule with all tools is use it if it works, don't use it if it doesn't work. So if it doesn't work for you, don't use it. But here's something that I use that works for me, and it's a mantra. Now, a mantra can sound a little woo, as a friend of mine says. But what is a mantra? A mantra is a way of focusing a particular intention. And the mantra that I'm going to teach you, you can think of it as a prayer, but the truth is that it will work whether you believe in a God or whether you don't believe in a God. Another way to think of a mantra is a promise, but I think the best way to think of a mantra like this is that it's a bargain. It's a bargain with the universe. So you are going to show up and commit to something, and the universe is going to do something in return. So the mantra goes like this. It's very simple. I accept everything I see. That's it. I accept everything I see. This is something that I try to say to myself many times a day, at the beginning of the day and throughout the day, and especially if I see something that makes me very uncomfortable, something that makes me feel afraid, something that grabs me or hooks me in a particular way. I accept everything I see. So what I invite you to do as a tool for a week is to try using that mantra. I accept everything I see. And use it in all those situations. This is something you can use, for example, when you look at yourself in the mirror, especially if you have issues around your own body or around your appearance. You can use it when you're looking at your spouse or your partner or your kids, especially if they're driving you crazy in that moment. And you can use it also just in various situations, again, if something makes you uncomfortable, if something makes you feel afraid. I accept everything I see. And pay attention to what shows up. Because here's the thing. There are some things that you simply cannot see. There are some things that the universe will not show you until you are ready to accept them. So you are announcing an intention that I am going to accept whatever shows up. So as you do that, pay attention to what does show up, because you may find that you are seeing some things that you hadn't seen before. Compassionate seeing is a practice and a habit and a skill. And what that means is that you get better by doing it. It's not something that is simply going to descend upon you. There won't be a moment of illumination after which you will unfailingly see everything in the rosy glow of compassion. It requires practice, it requires repetition, and it requires hard work. That's not a popular message in spirituality, but the truth is that the truth is really popular. You just have to keep doing it. And if something feels awkward or forced to you, for example, saying, okay, I recognize the difference between myself and the other person, I put myself in that other person's place, I make this imaginative leap, I accept everything I see, that can feel a little awkward and forced. But I want you to trust me that as you continue to practice, it gets more and more fluid, and it becomes more and more second nature.